In 1570, a Flemish cartographer named Abraham Ortelius published the first modern atlas. It was not a curiosity, not a fantasy. It was a reference document, consulted by scholars, diplomats, merchants across Europe. On its map of Central Asia, beneath a figure shown seated on a throne, Ortelius wrote 4 Latin words: Tartariae sive magni kami regni, the kingdom of the great Khan. Not a region, not a geographic placeholder, a kingdom with a ruler, with a lineage, covering more territory than any political entity on Earth at the time, from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. For the next 200 years, every major European cartographic tradition agreed. French maps, Dutch maps, German maps, all of them, same name, same territory, same sovereign acknowledgement. Then, in a single generation around 1800, it stopped. The name disappeared, not gradually, not organically, all at once. And nobody in any official history ever explained why. But to understand what really happened, we need to understand what that name was actually worth. The name Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, is one of the most consistent labels in 2 centuries of European cartography. By the mid-1700s, cartographers were no longer treating it as a vague geographic category. They were subdividing it. Chinese Tartary, Western Tartary, Independent Tartary. You do not subdivide a legend. You do not create administrative taxonomy for something that does not exist. The Encyclopedia Britannica of the early 18th century contains entries treating Tartarian lineage as a living political reality. Tamerlane, founder of the empire later known as Mughal India, is described not as a conqueror, but as a prince of a specific Tartarian bloodline. These were not decorative entries. These were the best available intelligence on the political structure of the world. And then there is the 1691 French diplomatic dispatch referring to something called the court of the Tartar king. Not a named khanate, not a regional successor state. The court, a functioning political institution requiring diplomatic protocol. What was being negotiated? We do not fully know. The dispatch exists. The surrounding context does not. Here is what we do know. At approximately the same historical moment, 3 separate empires underwent simultaneous cartographic revision. Russia, expanding eastward under Catherine the Great, the British East India Company consolidating its reach, the Ottoman Empire renegotiating its northern borders. All 3 had a common problem. The lands they were absorbing already had a name on the map, and under the legal frameworks of European imperial expansion, a named sovereignty complicated annexation. It created questions of prior claim. It required justification. Empty land required no justification at all. In the 1730s, a German historian named Gerhard Friedrich Müller spent years traveling through Siberia on behalf of the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences. He was methodical. He was thorough. He compiled enormous archives, documents about the peoples, the governance structures, the settlement patterns of the Russian interior. In the 1740s, Müller presented his findings. The presentation was interrupted. His papers were confiscated. He was formally censured. The official reason given, his sources were insufficiently verified, his presentation was premature. The censured material was not published, it was not reviewed and corrected, it was removed. What Muller had found across years of archival work in the Russian interior were records of governance structures that predated Russian expansion into those territories, documents that complicated the picture of Siberia as empty land awaiting Russian civilization. In 1768, roughly 20 years after Muller's papers were taken, Catherine the Great commissioned an official history of Russia, a comprehensive narrative establishing Russia's authority over the vast Siberian and Central Asian territories as ancient, legitimate, and continuous. The history that emerged established a specific framework. Russia had always been the legitimate authority here. The territories to the east and south were not absorbed from an existing political order. They were civilized from a state of ungoverned wilderness. At the same time, Russian maps began replacing older Tartarian place names with new Russian designations. In certain regions of Siberia, the new maps did something more specific. They depicted entirely new settlement patterns. Towns appeared on post-Catherine maps with no corresponding record in pre-Catherine sources. The mainstream explanation: the new maps reflected actual new settlements. Russian colonization was actively occurring. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. Terra Nullius, empty land. It is one of the most consequential legal doctrines in the history of empire. Under the framework of European international law, a territory could only be legally claimed if it could be established that the territory had no prior sovereign, no recognized government, no acknowledged ruler, no legitimate political authority. If a sovereign existed, even a diminished one, the claim of empty land failed. Annexation required negotiation. It required admitting that someone had been there before you. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented imperial legal practice. And for 3 empires simultaneously expanding in the late 18th century, Russia, Britain, and the reforming Ottoman state, the maps of Central Asia presented a specific legal problem. The maps showed a name. The maps showed, with increasing specificity, a sovereign tradition called Tartaria, governed by a lineage called the Great Khan, acknowledged by 2 centuries of European diplomatic and cartographic reference literature. Ask yourself this: if that name was merely a cartographic convenience, why would removing it require the simultaneous effort of 3 separate imperial bureaucracies? Why would it require the suppression of a historian's archival findings? Why would it require a commissioned official history explicitly designed to establish prior Russian authority over those same territories? Geographic conveniences do not require suppression. Inconvenient sovereignties do. The cartographic rupture of the late 18th century was not a natural evolution of geographic knowledge. The name stopped being written because writing it was no longer legally convenient to the powers who controlled the presses. The cartographic tradition that had persisted since Ortelius does not fade. It stops within a single generation, not by accident, by design. The world was told that Tartaria was never real, that it was a geographic misunderstanding, a vague European label for territories imperfectly understood. The reality the data points to is more specific than that. For 2 centuries, European cartographers, encyclopedists, and diplomatic dispatches treated the Tartarian sovereign tradition as a living political reality. They subdivided it, they assigned it lineages, they attributed the founding of empires to its princes. What happened in the late 18th century was not the arrival of better geographic knowledge, it was the arrival of imperial necessity. 3 empires needed the same thing at the same time: legal vacancy in the territories they were absorbing. And the most efficient way to create legal vacancy in a territory that had been named on every major European map for 200 years was to change the maps. Gerhard Friedrich Müller's confiscated papers have never been fully published. Catherine the Great's commissioned history established a framework that Russian cartographic and archival practice would follow for generations. For 200 years, this remained not hidden exactly. The old maps survived, in libraries, in archives, accessible to anyone who looked, but unasked, because the question itself had been made to seem not worth asking, not by accident, by administrative design. The most specific version of what was erased is not an empire, it is a legal claim. The prior sovereign claim that, if acknowledged, would have required 3 expanding empires to negotiate rather than annex. The name on the map was not just a name. It was, in the legal grammar of its time, a title deed. And the most efficient way to invalidate a title deed was to ensure it was never written again. This is not just history. The doctrine of Terra Nullius was formally rejected by the Australian High Court only in 1992. The legal acknowledgement that land claimed as empty had in fact been governed, inhabited, and sovereignly held for thousands of years came 2 centuries after the annexation had already happened. The pattern of erasing prior sovereignty from the cartographic and archival record to create legal vacancy for annexation did not end in the 18th century. It was practiced in every major colonial expansion that followed. The maps changed, the names changed. The official histories established frameworks of prior vacancy that subsequent generations inherited without question. Most people will never connect these dots. They will look at the old maps and see a cartographic curiosity. They will look at Catherine the Great's History Commission and see normal imperial administration. Now you can see it differently. The data tells a completely different story, one in which the suppression of Müller's papers, the commissioning of official histories, the simultaneous revision of maps across 3 imperial bureaucracies were not independent coincidences. They were the same operation. The answer has been sitting in the libraries of Europe for 200 years, in the old maps, in the encyclopedic entries, in the Latin words that Ortelius wrote beneath a figure on a throne. The kingdom of the great Khan. It was real enough to name, and real enough to unname. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius looked at what he knew of the world and put a king on the map. 200 years later, the king was gone. Not defeated, not documented as fallen, simply removed. Rendered nameless in the cartographic record of an era that needed him not to have existed. The absence is still there if you know how to read it. The old maps are in the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, digitized, publicly accessible. If this story deserved to be uncovered, help us find the next one. Next time, we go deeper into the architectural evidence, the buildings that appeared across the American frontier fully formed, the foundations that do not match their documented timelines, and the one structure from the 1993 World's Fair that was never demolished. What survives tends to survive for a reason. The truth is stranger than the silence surrounding it.